The real purpose of the digital ID can be found on the World Economic Forum website, where they have this chart. And you will see in this chart that basically you will need to have a digital ID in order to do everything on this chart. To access healthcare, insurance, and treatment, open bank accounts, and carry on online transactions, to travel, to access humanitarian services, to shop and conduct business transactions, to participate in social media, to own a communication device like a cell phone or a computer, to pay your taxes, collect government benefits, and to vote. So if you don't have a digital ID, you're going to be shut out of basically every aspect of civilized life on Earth.
So the purpose of this press conference is to provide you with a first critical analysis from the legal and constitutional perspective of what has been concluded or not concluded by the 77th World Health Assembly. This whole topic is widely underreported and not sufficiently understood. Therefore, we as the lawyers, we feel it as our obligation to inform the world and the people and also the representatives from the different countries with respect to the far-reaching effects that these two new legal instruments will have. Regarding the new pandemic treaty, we already knew at the beginning of this week that it was going to postpone. Regarding the amendments to the international health regulations, there were intense negotiations going on late into this night under the tremendous pressure of the representatives of the United States to come to a conclusion. What can we say about what is on the table? Where do we have the highest concern, and why do we have to raise our voice against these two legal instruments? In particular, the amendments to the IHR as we have them on the table as drafts right now. Number one, you have all heard that there is a binding rule in the international health regulations themselves, Article 55, paragraph 2, that clearly states that the final wording of any amendment to the international health regulations must be submitted to the member states at least 4 months in advance. The World Health Organization claims to have done so by submitting to the world and publishing in November 2022 a compilation of 300 different proposals, almost not consolidated, in fact, with many different options for many different provisions in the same time. And what we have seen from the latest drafts, they brought new aspects into the game that nobody knew before, like what we have seen in Annex 1. And it is a matter of principle that all those parties that are involved and affected by the new rules are given their voice and their consent before the delegates can give their vote in favor of an agreement. Therefore, we certainly must never put aside this 4 months rule. Then we have to clearly state that this instrument, this legal instrument of a regulation, was never meant to comprise so far-reaching new rules that affect member states but also citizens. And here I give you just a brief enumeration of the most relevant far-reaching rules that we see on the table in the international health regulations in combination with the pandemic treaty. Number one, Annex 1 to the international health regulations under the title of core capacity provides far-reaching duties, imposes far-reaching duties onto the member states and their regions and their municipalities also to establish a system of permanent surveillance with the principle or the method that is then governed by the treaty of genomic sequencing. Here, this is one aspect where we see far-reaching duties coming up to the states and to their local regions and communities. Number two, we have an arbitrarian widening of a pretext for a fake that other of my colleagues will go into more detail but we will see that it is arbitrarian how the WHO wants to allow itself to base a public health emergency of international concern on no standardized procedures based on a constant surveillance. We will have Reggie Middleton, my colleague Beate Bahner, and Professor Trito speak about this principle of constant surveillance, and Professor Trito about the unlawful method of genomic sequencing. And number three, this concept of infodemics. Although the term was removed from the treaty, but still the provisions we see in the amendments and the treaty combined together, we see that WHO will be strengthened, and member states as well, in their authority to dominate and control the publicly available information. Just go into Annex 1 of the IHR, go into the treaty, go to the homepage of the World Health Organization, also research about Infodemics Manager, which is a program that exists already for many years, and so on. What does it mean? By strengthening WHO's capacity to control the information, we are going to deprive people of the factual basis for the decision-making process, and that is an element of actually dragging people into a behavior, in particular a treatment that they do not want, and ultimately a violation of mandatory international and national laws regarding the informed consent, which will be further elaborated by my colleague Sue Gray from New Zealand and by my colleague Dr. Beate Pfeil from Germany. Further, WHO's next point, the authority to define substances, specific substances, as a precondition for traveling, and to use even and recommend even substances that have never been tested before, but authorized only under the regime of emergency use authorization. I refer to the treaty Article 14 and to the IHR rules Article 36 and Annex 6. That will result in the member states not being able to protect their own population against uncalculable health risks from experimental substances. And again, it will result in the breach of the most fundamental rules to protect informed consent. Further, we must state that with all this, and I have just given you some examples, but there are further accruals and increasing powers of the WHO, in particular also financial powers. We do not see anything that could be called an checks and balances or quality control and correction mechanism. With such a far-reaching range of powers, it is a matter of legal principality that a mechanism of quality control and correction be established. Otherwise, this is a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of democratic constitution. Now, all of this taken together, we see these far-reaching provisions, and as I said, so far-reaching new rules obliging member states and their citizens ultimately, and affecting their citizens, were never meant to be put into this instrument of regulations as it is defined in the World Health Organization's constitution in Article 21. They are meant only to rule about technical standards. Now, we have a fundamental objection against any attempt to rush into these uncharted waters and to grant the WHO even more powers and more financial capacities without ever having done a proper, professional, and critical assessment of all aspects of the WHO's pandemic management and of its recommendations and communications of the past. We believe that this should be the absolute first step before enlarging the powers of the WHO and giving the WHO more financial means. Since 2020, the World Health Assembly never acknowledged the urgent need for effective quality control of WHO's and member states' own pandemic management. if we do not undergo this process that might be harmful for WHO and the member states, we clearly embark on a road where further and similar damages are pre-programmed. And as we all know, the sole purpose of WHO, according to its own constitution, is to protect people from any harm and to foster health of the people of the world. What we see now is a program to harm people's health and people's right. That was just an overview of the most important aspects. Now, I gladly hand over the word and the floor to my dear colleague, Reggie Middleton from the United States.
So we come to you as lawyers from 9 different countries to sound the alarm about the pandemic treaty, and we want to show you chapter and verse exactly why, from a legal perspective, we are very concerned about these 2 treaties. One is the One Health approach. This can be found in Article 5 of the May 27, 2024 draft of the pandemic treaty. So what is One Health? In the introduction, the use of terms, it defines One Health as a means of an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance, that's the important word, balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. So what does that mean? It means that people are not the main concern. Our interests have to be balanced against those of animals and plants and the ecosystem. So number one, this is what the Lancet calls the call to ecological equity, and they say all life is equal and of equal concern. So that means that your life, my life, the lives of our children, our parents, our loved ones are equal and of equal concern to the life of a cockroach or a mosquito. Furthermore, what One Health does is bring basically every aspect of life on Earth under the purview of the World Health Assembly, or the World Health Organization. So they are basically saying that everything needs to be surveilled and that they can issue what they would call recommendations, which many countries will interpret as being basically orders, on the front of human health, animal health, plant health, and the ecology, which means that they can use climate change as to assert their authority in the climate change area, say, look, the climate is hurting health, et cetera. I mean, they can even get into aspects of war between nations, that it's bad for health, try to insert themselves in that way. So, and how are they going to implement this? They don't tell us. They say that it's going to be further defined in an instrument that is going to be created in the future. Now, Article 4 of the Pandemic Treaty talks about pandemic prevention and public health surveillance and calls for multi-sectoral surveillance and risk assessment, saying the parties recognize the environmental, climatic, social, anthropogenic, and economic factors that lead to human health. There again, all of these factors lead to human health under the One Health approach, and that means they get to surveil all of these areas of human existence, basically every aspect of human existence under the One Health. How are they going to do this? They're going to do this through digital IDs, in part. That's how they're going to surveil. Keep going. Here, and so the pretext of these digital IDs is the idea that in order to protect our health, they have to surveil us in terms of whether we're vaccinated, whether we're sick, et cetera. But I think that the real purpose of the digital ID can be found on the World Economic Forum website, where they have this chart. And you will see in this chart that basically you will need to have a digital ID in order to do everything on this chart. To access healthcare insurance and treatment, open bank accounts, and carry on online transactions, to travel, to access humanitarian services, to shop and conduct business transactions, to participate in social media, to own a communication device like a cell phone or a computer, to pay your taxes, collect government benefits, and to vote. So if you don't have a digital ID, you're going to be shut out of basically every aspect of civilized life on Earth. And not only that, but through their surveillance, they will be able to tell whether or not you are in compliance. So the surveillance number one is whether or not you're vaccinated. But they're going to be surveilling all. If you need a digital ID to access all of these things, then there's going to be a digital record of you in all of these aspects of your life. And what this does is it provides the platform for the China social credit system, which is how I got involved with all of this. My original organization deals with women's rights in China. And when I saw this digital ID, I said, oh my gosh, this is the China social credit system going worldwide. And in China, they amalgamate all of these aspects of your life, and they give you a score. And if you have a high score, you can have freedom. And if you have a low score, they will cut you off from your bank accounts, your credit cards. And if you keep it up, they will just disappear you. And if you think this can't happen, it did happen already to the Canadian truckers when they were severed from their bank accounts and their credit cards for having a protest on vaccine mandates. Now, the pandemic agreement in Chapter 3 establishes the Conference of the Parties. And the only thing I have time to say about the Conference of the Parties is it's a completely separate entity. But what it does is it has the ability to amend the pandemic treaty. And there's no ratification process for that. So that the various governments could hammer out something finally everybody can agree with, and then the Conference of the Parties can just change it. And there's no ratification process that goes back to the nations. Regarding the international health regulations, there is a provision there about censorship. This is in Annex 1, core capacities. And each state party shall develop core capacities for risk communication, including addressing misinformation and disinformation. They don't define what those are, but I would commend to you that this is going to be anything that is counter narrative to what the WHO is putting out. So this is a way of shutting down scientific debate. That's all the time I have to talk to you about this, but I would say that we are facing an existential threat to our national sovereignty and our personal medical freedom, and we are at a moment in human history where we really need to draw a line in the sand and say, we'll go so far and no further. The European Union and the World Economic Forum last year already started rolling out these digital IDs and these vaccine passports. They don't need to have these agreements in place in order to effectuate what I would call a digital gulag, because I showed you the chart from the World Economic Forum of all the things that they're going to be surveilling us on. They're going to be able to control us on it. And once this is operationalized, which could happen anytime soon, they don't have to wait for the passage of these treaties. There will be no more dissent, because if you try to dissent, you're going to be surveilled, you're going to be censored, you can be cut off from your credit cards and your bank accounts, and just basically paralyzed from society. And the time to stand up is now, because once we lose our freedom, it will be basically impossible to get it back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm a lawyer and independent researcher and a former Council of Europe expert, and my focus is on human rights, national minorities, and most recently also the WHO. I'm a member of different legal initiatives dealing with this subject. The two WHO treaties represent a threat to the dignity, freedom, and even to the health of the people around the world. First, as we all know, the WHO is now almost 85% dependent on voluntary donations, and the private donors include pharmaceutical foundations and organizations. We all know the Gates Foundation, round the corner here, and Gavi. Second, scientific evidence presupposes free scientific discourse. Instead, the WHO has set itself the goal of combating misinformation and disinformation. So what about scientific evidence if an important part of the scientific community is being excluded from this scientific discourse? It is precisely here, and of course we have censorship, as my colleague has also membered, in the wake of these regulations. It is precisely here in the area that sensitively affects freedom of opinion, information, and science, and also the freedom of the media, that the WHO has established around 40 partnerships with big tech companies from the digital sector, whose contracts are just as undisclosed as the financing of the WHO infodemic activities. The Global Health Responsibility Agency, governed by Dr. Silvia Behrendt from Austria, has also long since drawn attention to another lack of transparency. For example, although WHO staff and experts must regularly submit conflict of interest declarations, these are generally not published with reference to confidentiality and data protection, but are only managed internally by the WHO Secretariat. There is also no standardized procedure for cases of rule violations by WHO management personnel in the context of corruption prevention. Another point, in this context, the fact that both treaties now focus on so-called health products, including, of course, vaccines, and their equitable distribution leaves a stale aftertaste. All the more so as, according to the emergency use listing procedure of August 2022, the relevant expert reports are merely recommendations, and the WHO has, I cite, full control over any subsequent decisions and actions of these committees, including whether or not to publish the findings and recommendations in a WHO public report. However, this is precisely where full transparency would be called for, as it is ultimately the health and physical integrity of the world's population that the WHO actually has declared to protect. So, to conclude, there are no efficient safeguards against abuses of power, and, for example, this opens the door to the arbitrary declaration of fakes and arbitrary recommendations of measures such as vaccinations, testing obligations, isolation and quarantine, travel and trade restrictions, or even lockdowns, which ultimately have not been sufficiently tested for their effectiveness or harmfulness. So the WHO has long been operating outside a framework that is still acceptable for democratic constitutional states under the rule of law. At stake are elementary human rights that have long been recognized under international law, not least the right to physical integrity and health. The WHO plans must therefore be rejected. Thank you.